Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Jing. I run the Center for China Analysis here at Asia Study, but tonight I'm your MC. It is actually my first time to be MC in the United States, and I'm told that it's good to break a joke or two here in the USA. But I have to confess, as a serious China scholar, I don't know much jokes. So I have to come to my daughter, who's 8 years old, but educated in the USA, to come up some jokes for me. So if the joke goes well, all credits goes to Caroline, who's in the room. If it doesn't go well, I take full responsibility. I guess that's how parenthood works. Anyway, here it is. So in the year of 2025, which of the following were jumps higher? Number one, a wet raccoon with a bad hairstyle. You know who I'm talking about. Two, Trump's tariffs against China. Three, Guangdong's youth unemployment rate. Fourth, China's nationalistic sentiment. Fifth, President Xi's popularity rate in South America. Who wants to have a try? The right answer is obvious, is the red raccoon with a bad hairstyle, because the rest simply doesn't jump, if you get the joke. But if we go a little bit deeper, you will understand all of them are interrelated. And that's what we're actually doing at the Center for China Analysis, to provide integrated analyses. And you will read that from the report we're launching today, China 2025. And also you will see and read many of the discussion that is happening tonight. And I'm happy to report the report we have launched has been well received. A lot of media has already covered that, and we have more friends from the press tonight, from the Financial Times, The Economist, Bloomberg, New York Times, South China Post, and a few others. Feel free to cover more. I'm also glad to share that different partners of CCA has already started translating this report into French, Spanish, Italian, and of course Chinese. But I want to also emphasize all of this won't happen without a wonderful team at CCA and Asia Society. I have thanked a lot of people already in the video. There's one group I have intentionally left out I want to thank here in person, is those who have worked behind the scenes. So could I please invite the audience to give a round of applause to the unsung heroes, those who have worked behind the scenes, and all our families who have been quietly supporting us with unconditional love. Thank you all. And speaking of family, CCA could not thrive without the support of Asia Society family. So in that spirit, with great pleasure, I give you the head of our current family, the global CEO and president, the first female foreign minister of South Korea, Dr. Kyung-wha. Thank you for your support, Kyung-wha. The floor is yours.
Good evening. Well, I don't have a joke, but really delighted to be here to welcome all of you. We're all here to mark the release of China 2025, What to Watch, the flagship report published each year by our Center for China Analysis of the Asia Society Policy Institute. 2025 will be a critical year for China and for the rest of the world. I think that's an understatement. This year's report, as the title indicates, zeroes in on the most important China-related developments to watch in the year ahead. I would like to thank everyone at the ASPI Center for China Analysis for all of their hard work on the report and for organizing this event. I particularly want to thank CCA co-founder and managing director Jing for his leadership of CCA, all CCA fellows and staff gathering here from around the world, as well as the 16 authors of the report. Many thanks also go to all of our speakers appearing on stage tonight. In just 2 years, CCA has grown from only a handful of individuals to a global team of more than 50 staff and fellows spanning 11 countries. It has already established a strong track record as a leading China knowledge hub and an innovative think and do tank on China. Its global family of experts has consistently produced high-quality, independent, and objective analysis with a focus on policy impact and relying extensively on primary Chinese language source material. They have published dozens of policy papers and initiated multiple Track 1.5 dialogues with Chinese government officials, experts, and academics. CCA has also opened new grounds with its interactive websites, Decoding Chinese Politics, Taiwan Policy Database, and Global Public Opinions on China. These help hundreds of thousands of users understand the complexities of Chinese domestic politics, trends in global public opinion on China, and other timely issues of interest to policymakers, China watchers, and the general public. These are uncertain, fluid times, and the coming year will likely be pivotal for China, the United States, and the world. CCA's inside-out approach to independent policy-relevant analysis will be more critical than ever. Our goal tonight is to spark new ideas, inspire informed, respectable debate, and challenge the way many of us think about China. And we have more great things in store in the year ahead, and we are just getting started. Thank you all again for your support for Asia Society and the ASPI Center for China Analysis, and for coming tonight. I know that we are all in for a very enjoyable, informative evening.
Thank you, Kyung-wha, and for your encouraging and very, very inspiring remarks. We are convinced that the mission of CCA is more relevant than ever. The meaningful work of CCA is needed more than ever. And I'm also very glad to report that based on our internal strategy meeting this morning, our work of year 2025 will be more interesting than ever. So stay tuned. And as Kevin has eloquently identified, there are mega trends of our time which will shape our work. From the Trump 2.0 and the implications it will bring us from tech, trade, climate, public health, and global order, to the global realignment around the intensified US-China competition on the issues have just been mentioned, to all the internal changes in China and what will be the implications, giving you a few examples. For example, the generals that are missing in China, what do they mean for Chinese elite politics? What do they mean for Taiwan? Jack Ma is now back. Alibaba is back to the Chinese New Year Gala. What do those mean for Chinese private entrepreneurs? As Kevin mentioned, thousands of Chinese youths are riding bikes in the middle of the evening. What do they mean for Chinese society and state society interactions? And thousands of millions of Chinese with mental health issues, what do they mean for Chinese public health challenges? And I think our 3 panels with 4 spotlight presentations tonight hopefully will shed some light to those questions. But before I turn to our first panel, there's one housekeeping matter I ask to remind you all. We have interactive elements tonight. There's 3 polling questions. We welcome your participation. We also welcome your question to the 3 panels. On the page 2 of the program, there's 2 QR codes. Please scan and participate, and your participation will be rewarded. We have prepared 3 gifts with CCA characteristics. We'll have 2 lottery winners tonight. And there's 3 gifts. You can pick 2 out of 3. Gift number 1 is a free dinner tonight with all the authors, okay? It's a free buffet dinner, the best buffet dinner you will ever have at HSI. Right? The second is 2 free hours of questions with CCA experts on anything China related. I mean, anything China related. We have, as Kyung-wha said, 51 fellows cover everything China related. And third is 3 months of free access to all CCA private briefings inside Beijing Beltway, PLA monitoring, economic analysis, social sentiment, climate updates. So you can pick 2 out of 3 if you are selected. We're going to announce the first lottery winner on the break. and the second one at the end. So please participate. We'll announce that. Okay, now to the first panel, politics, Chinese politics. Politics first is the first principle to understand China. It seems to be the case for South Korea and for the United States now. The politicalization of things and securitization of things now have consequences in China and beyond. It has proliferated to state-society relationship, central-local relationship, civil-military relationship, as well as US-China relationship. Our first panel discussion today, I hope they're going to come to the stage at some point. Are you coming? Will be led by our senior fellow, Susie Jakes, who is also the editor-in-chief of China File, who will help with his first-class panelists to decode Chinese domestic politics. So over to you, Susie.
Thanks. Okay. Good evening. As Jing said, I'm Susie Jakes. I'm the editor of the online magazine China File, but I'm delighted to be here tonight in my capacity as a senior fellow at CCA, a role for which I am eternally grateful to Jing and Kevin for inviting me to take on 2 years ago when we launched. Our topic tonight is China's domestic politics. Our theme, broadly speaking, is Xi Jinping's aspirations for China's future and the ways that his vision tangles and sometimes collides with China's economic, political, and social realities. Our time is quite brief, and my colleagues Neil Thomas, Hugo Guang, Lynette Ong, and John Osberg are brimming with insight on many dimensions of this topic, and so we're going to get right into it. But I do want to underline, because I didn't understand this until just before we came on stage, that after we talk, we're going to invite questions from you, but we're not passing microphones. You need to use the QR code that Jing just showed you to submit them, and then they'll appear miraculously on this screen, and I can direct them to my colleagues. So please start submitting questions whenever you're so inspired. Neil, I think I'd like to start with you. You are the co-author of the opening essay in this terrific China 2025 collection. And your essay begins with the line, "What is good for Xi Jinping is not always good for China." And I thought that statement, sure to be somewhat provocative to our comrades in Beijing, might be a good place to start tonight. So explain yourself.
Yes, thank you. What is good for Xi Jinping is not always good for China, maybe sometimes. But we see in October 2022, Xi Jinping cemented his personal dominance at the 20th Party Congress, achieving maybe the greatest political victory at a party congress in the post-Mao era. But since October 2022, China has had a very difficult post-COVID recovery, marked by pessimism in Chinese society, marked by fiscal strain in local governments, increasing skepticism about the centre's policymaking abilities, and especially now, the rising chance of hostility in US-China relations. And so the point that me and my co-author, Lobsang Tsering, make in our contribution to China 2025 is that next year we could see an increasing disconnect between Xi's strong grip on elite politics in Beijing, in my view, and his relatively weaker ability to actually deliver governance outcomes on the ground. And this disconnect is important because it will lead to greater policy volatility, more economic uncertainty, and perhaps also greater social instability in China. And the context for this is that Xi seems to believe that his current policy agenda is right for China. I mean, he wants to move the economy away from rapid debt-fueled growth driven by real estate to a more high-quality development, in his words, that balances growth with social welfare, economic equality concerns, and technological self-reliance especially, which all sounds good, but he's also convinced that in order to do this, the party needs to play a stronger role in telling capital, capitalists, and most companies what to do. And that's why he stuck to his guns at the third plenum in July on these domestic and economic policy issues. That's why it was fairly poorly received by the international and also many parts of the domestic business community. It's something where occasion where he explicitly dismissed the concerns many people have about weak consumption and rising trade frictions as, quote, problems of transition to his, economic vision. But he also seems convinced that the problems and issues facing China at the moment are less the result of his policies and more the result of poor implementation of his policies by his cadres, which is leading him to, in my view, do more damage by tightening party discipline and ideological control even further. And so, if we look to yesterday's Politburo meeting, we obviously have signs that next year we will see more monetary and fiscal policy stimulus, which is a good thing. But in my view, these policies are not designed to negate Xi's agenda. They're designed to stabilize the economy in the short term in order to focus on Xi's existing policies in the longer term. And so if we look to 2025 and what's coming down the road, I think the most likely course is perhaps that Xi doubles down on political control, economic statism, national security. But we do have to bear in mind that Xi's a bit more complex than the caricature we sometimes make of him. And he's shown with the end of zero COVID, recent relaxation of some economic policies, private tutoring policies, which he was very personally identified with, that he can show some flexibility ideologically, even some pragmatism when it comes to his own political interests in avoiding major economic and social risks. So it's not traffic in all one direction, but it's probably still more in that direction. But the best case scenario is that he does expend a lot of his political capital next year to maybe shift gears by expanding on the hints we have in the third plenum about fiscal reforms, hukou reforms, private sector participation. So that'd be my best case scenario. And the key watch point next year is the instructions that Xi will give for drafting the 15th five-year plan, which will cover 2026 to 2030. They should come at a plenum of the CCP Central Committee, which will happen sometime in 2025. Xi's been very dodgy on actually going by the fixed calendar of Chinese politics. So we don't know when, but definitely sometime next year. So stay tuned for more CCA analysis on that.
Great. I think that's actually a perfect place for Guoguang, for you to jump in. As you write in your recent paper in this great collection, one of the ways, and as Neil just said, one of the ways that Xi is trying to bridge this disconnect between his power and his ability to deliver governance outcomes is through tightening control over the governing elite. And this is happening against a backdrop of large numbers of retirements of cadres who are aging out, purges, which you've also written about extensively in a paper that I'm excited we're going to be publishing in China File quite soon. And then there's going to be the appointment of this whole new generation of leaders born in the 1970s, so young like me. What can we expect from this process, and what kinds of challenges does Xi face in terms of getting party leaders to implement his vision?
Yeah, would like to follow my colleague, Neil Thomas, to emphasize actually Xi Jinping's concentration of power to control particularly parties to the elites and to discipline them, to actually tightly, request him for their loyalty. But at the same time, that kind of measures reduce, parties' elites' autonomy in governance, initiative in policy implementation, and also to reduce their personal interest before they could get personal, benefit from power, money exchange relationships. So all those opportunities were reduced. So this is major challenge, I think, not only in next year for the party leadership and for Xi Jinping, and even actively in the past several years, and also in years beyond 2025. So those guys, party state cadres, their incentives, that's really major, challenge to Xi Jinping. And in 2025, major reshuffling of provincial party state cadres will take place. Basically because about 1/5, deputy provincial level cadres, particularly provincial party standing committee members, would be replaced. So why this would happen? Basically, it's due to something I call institutional inconsistency regarding retirement age. So normally we know that there is a norm governing cadre retirement. So for those cadres at deputy provincial level and below, their normal retirement age is 60 years old. But this active policy is implemented based on individual case. When one cadre reaches 60 years old, exactly in that month, he or she would be retired, actively managed by party organization department. On the other side, the CCP system has some democratic elements appearing formalistic democratic elements. That means there are elections, regular elections. There are terms of office. So for those provincial standing committee members, so when you have elections, so how to determine their age, ceiling. So basically, when you reach 57, okay, you could continue your term. So that means you could be elected. But if you reach 58, normally you will not be be asked to retire. But at that year of election, you have to retire because you reach 58. You can't stay at office for another 5 years. So this institutional inconsistency makes problem for the party, cadre management. So last time, the election of standing committee member of a committee of provincial actively took place 3 years ago. So that means those who were elected to the party standing committee when they were at 57 years old. So in 2025, they will reach 60 years old. So they have to retire the next year. So that's why in the next year, about 50 members nationwide among less than 300 members of provincial party standing committee, they will retire. So there could be large-scale reshuffle of provincial leaders, at least the largest one before the next party congress, National Party Congress, which will take place in 2027.
And is the significance of that you think, well, what is the significance in terms of policy implementation? I mean, of having so many new people. Are they going to be more flexible, more pliable to the central leadership's desires, or less so?
Really good question, Susie. I think, so when the vacancies, come out, so some new cadres would be promoted. And under Xi Jinping, it seems that, competition for those kind of positions become even more intense than before because the norms are not so normal as before. So you need to find your connection, you need to gain, Xi Jinping's attention, a lot of things. So when you need to compete for those new positions, so I guess those party cadres, they will try to do two things. First, you need to show your loyalty to Xi Jinping and the party leadership. But at the same time, who actively does want to show less loyalty to Xi Jinping? Nobody, actually. So everybody tries to show their loyalties, so how Xi Jinping can choose among them. So at the same time, you need to show your capability in promoting economic development, in delivering better governance. But Xi Jinping's policies in general are contradictory with promoting economic development and to actively better governance. So you need to find actively a very narrow way between these two contradicting things. So show your loyalty to Xi Jinping, but still, with Xi Jinping's framework, you can promote economic development. So who can do that? Let's see who can do that in the next year. Who would be promoted?
Very interesting. I want to shift now a little away from the leaders to the people that they lead with some questions for the two of you. John, another area of Xi Jinping's efforts at the moment is focused on inculcating party ideology, especially at a time when the lingering fallout of the handling of COVID-19, particularly the lockdowns, the breakdown of trust that came out of that, the kind of frustration. We were talking about this earlier especially with the most local levels of government, the economic slowdown, high youth unemployment, all seem to be contributing to this sense of widespread malaise, alienation, and alienation from precisely the kind of abject fealty that Xi Jinping seems to want to promote. So in your research, how have you seen this dynamic playing out?
Right, so thanks, Susan. So I think one of the trends that you saw under Xi that was a sort of a departure from the reform era norm was this attempt to kind of micromanage what people believe in a way. And one manifestation of that was the Study the Great Nation app, Shui Xi Kyung-wha, that was a required study for government officials and other state employees. You also, in the realm of religion, which has really been the focus of my recent research, you see this campaign, the sinification of religion, and you see, I think, Beijing under Xi sort of views religion as a vehicle for dissemination of ideals and loyalty to the party. And this is also a kind of departure from the first couple of decades of the reform era. And my sense in studying forms of religion among the middle class over the past decade or so is that these efforts have backfired and that people sort of see them as very ham-fisted attempts to sort of engineer a certain set of beliefs. And in fact, what I've seen among some of the middle class people that I've done research with is that they've been attracted to religious traditions they perceive to be at the margins of state control. So in the past, I think from the mid-90s up into the present, the sort of two forms of religious practice that have seen the most explosive growth in urban areas, at least, are Protestant Christianity, and in particular unofficial forms of it. But also something I've specifically been working on is Tibetan Buddhism. And the reason that I argue that the urban middle class has been drawn to Tibetan Buddhism is they see it as sort of untainted in a way by party control, by commercialization, which they see as having had a corrupted influence on Chinese temples. And so just to bring it back to the sort of post-COVID moment, I mean, I think the economic downturn, the sort of struggles that people are facing, their children finding work, their businesses failing, these are also driving people towards religion, and it's driving people towards forms of religion that I think they perceive as sort of less under the sort of influence of the party state. Really interesting.
Lynette, you've recently been looking into another result of people's disaffection at the moment, which is Chinese citizens just deciding to pack up and leave China, runism, as it's sometimes called. Talk a little bit about that. How big a phenomenon is that, and do you expect that to continue to increase, what would turn it back around in the other direction? It must be quite worrying to leadership.
So I think, post-COVID, there are two types of people that are leaving China. One is the very wealthy as well as the middle class. Those people who have got the money and have the capacity to leave and have the talent will bring their talent and their wealth overseas to New York, to Toronto, to London, to Singapore, and to Tokyo, among the most popular destinations. And they have got all sorts of creative ways because of capital control in China. They use all sorts of creative ways, including funneling money through drug trade in the United States to bring their money out in order to avert the measures imposed by capital control. But there's another type of people who are leaving China, which is, there's always been there, but there has been a spike, I think, and a spike of 3 times the number of people post-COVID, is the number of people who came through to the United States and more recently to Europe and entering through, so they would fly from, let's say, Thailand or Turkey or Hong Kong to Ecuador, which used to allow Chinese people to enter the country visa-free, and then they'll walk all the way through the Panama, the Darien Gap, and through Mexico and to enter either the United States, either through Texas or California. So the illegal route, the Zhou-xian people, there has been a spike. And recently, Ecuador say, the Chinese people cannot enter our country anymore visa-free. But these people with their snake heads have all sorts of ways to avert that. Could went in through third country. I have been told by people who have recently done that. And I think this is kind of the wider phenomenon of people who are increasingly dissatisfied with the regime. I think if you are dissatisfied, you are not happy with the regime, it could manifest in a number of ways. One is exit. If you have the capacity, you could just exit the system. But before exit, people who are unhappy would typically want to make their voice known. That might take the form of petition, protest. But as we know, in China, protest is illegal and it actually could invite trouble, right? So protest is inherently risky. You want to protest, you want to calculate the benefit and cost. You might get fired, you might invite trouble to your family members. Protest, voice, exit, and the other type, Kevin mentioned earlier, the discourse of Tangping, lying flat. So China is used for a long time for its 996 culture. People work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. For as long as I've studied China, people have been so hardworking for its 996 culture. That is changing too. So the Department of Statistics in China actually had some statistics collected recently to register the number of people, the number of hours that people actually work. That has shown a small decline. So it's not just a discourse anymore. People actually are putting in less hours into their work. Why? Because they see that tomorrow's future is actually not brighter than today. So why should I work so hard? So what do all these means among the for the investors and policymakers sitting among us? You might be wondering what this implies. I think this implies a couple of things. China is the second superpower. It's an increasingly unstable society. But don't get me wrong, we are not going to see what happened in Syria with the Assad regime happening in China anytime soon. I'm not implying that at all. But I think what it means is that it's increasingly easy to tip the scale. China used to be a very stable society. Yes, there's kind of pockets of protest here and there, and people could come up with all sorts of statistics, but relatively stable. And the repressive apparatus, the government repressive system, the Wewen system, has been really doing an excellent job in preempting and preventing people from conducting collective action, from stopping a group of people going out there to protest. Before you could plot that sort of things, the government could actually stop you. But more recently, people have been doing all sorts of creative things like mass cycling. Is it a protest? maybe it's not really a protest, but it's a way of expressing your dissatisfaction or your grievance in a creative way, or a string of violent incidents, which is a lone wolf type of incident, which is the system cannot actually preempt that because it's way too costly. And I think this is something to watch, the increasing signs of instability in China.
Well, I think we may only have a couple minutes left, and we got a great collection of questions from all of you. Nobody in this audience is lying flat. But I have to just pick one, which is very hard. But I think it's going to be this one, and maybe we don't have time for each of you to answer it. Somebody's just going to have to jump in. Here's the question. As China faces mounting economic pressures, including slowing growth and demographic challenges, how do you see the Chinese Communist Party balancing its need for political control with the imperative for economic performance? This is Kevin's question. But here's the tricky part. Are there specific trade-offs you foresee becoming unavoidable in 2025?
I think, people in the field, I've got students in the field interviewing local officials. Already they are showing that the government used to prioritize economic growth above everything else. That's how usually officials are evaluated. But these days, it is not. It is about party loyalty. It is about social stability, trumping economic growth. So there's clearly a trade-off, and I think Xi Jinping, through the institutional channels, is sending a signal that we are willing to deprioritize economic growth, and we are going to prioritize social stability and loyalty to the party.
Anybody else
I think,
want to jump in?
she's been very explicit that he's happy to tolerate lower growth in service of these other social and political and international goals that he has. I mean, it's a mistake to say that growth isn't important. It clearly is something, but it's gone from a question of how do we maximize growth to how do we ensure a baseline of growth that we need to, realize national rejuvenation and, propel everything else. But it's gone from that maximization to maintaining a baseline, which is a big shift compared to earlier years.
Well, I'm sorry we have to stop there, but this is also a perfect entree for our colleagues who are about to come up for a panel about China's economy. So please join me in thanking my panelists and welcoming the next panel.
Jack is back. I think Ant IPO might go ahead. Alibaba is also back to the Chinese New Year Gala, which is, some of you might know, the Chinese equivalent of the Super Bowl. So what could be, we anticipating, would that be a brief spring for the Chinese private entrepreneurs? So one key question I would actually put to this wonderful panel, as I put to my own econ team at CCA, is that without the fundamental change of the ideological and the political directions in China, and with the heightened US-China competition and the geopolitical situation, what are the economic indicators we should be looking for without being dogmatic about the change that couldn't happen? So next panel, moderated by G.A. Donovan, our fellow of Chinese Society and Political Economy, will help us shed some light on this. Over to you, Jay.
Thank you very much and welcome. Yeah, thank you very much and welcome. As Susan so kindly pointed out, the question at the end of the last panel really was a great introduction to our topic. It's been a very rough few years for the Chinese economy. After an almost 40-year run of nearly 10% GDP growth on average every year, GDP growth in China started to slow around 2015 to around 6-7%. And then in 2020, of course, the year of COVID, slid way back to 2%. It's since recovered a bit, a big bump the following year, and then around 3% in 2022, 5% in 2023. But now, of course, the good news in China came yesterday, and I understand from my contacts in Shanghai and the markets in Hong Kong. People are very, very happy and excited to hear the new raft of stimulus measures that were just announced. But like happened in September when some stimulus measures were announced, the initial ebullience soon cooled. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But what I'd like to get started is to ask Lizzie about China's industrial policy. Now, industrial policy in China comes in for a lot of criticism. Domestically, people point to the fact that it diverts resources to these favored industries, new technologies, new energy, away from more traditional sort of bread and butter manufacturers and small businesses. And of course, overseas, people point to these policies as a source of unfair subsidies that are prejudiced against foreign manufacturers. So Lizzie, can you tell us a bit about where you see China's industrial policy and where you see it going in 2025?
Right. Well, thank you, GA, and thank you for this audience. So, in short, I think China's industrial policy is going to have more teeth in 2025. It's about to get leaner. It's about to get meaner. We used to think of China's industrial policy as a set of like bloated, wasteful, and inefficient policies. You know, this throw money at everything, hopefully something will stick approach. That's not the case anymore. And I think we're going to see a clearer trend toward a leaner and meaner direction. So specifically, I think we're going to see three emerging trends. Domestically, I think we're going to see serious consolidation in oversupplied sectors, including batteries, EVs, and solar. What that means is China is going to create a smaller set of firms that are more competitive and more profitable internationally. So that's my first prediction. Second prediction, I think we're going to see more coordination from the top. We're going to see SOEs and party leading working groups acting as grand orchestrators, channeling resources, channeling R&Ds, channeling capitals into sectors that matter most to Beijing. So we're going to see more coordination at the top, led by SOEs. That's something we have never seen before, but before Third Plenum, to be specific. And third, I think most importantly, is we're going to see this whole system, including investment policy, capital market, education system, regional and local policies, and incentives for the bureaucratic system, completely rewired to back up China's industrial policy goals. So Beijing is really doubling down there. I think the real question is whether this new, more coordinated approach is going to deliver real results. And I think here, the picture is still very much mixed. We can talk more about the specifics.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. Now, Chen Qiheng, in your piece for the China 2025 report, you wrote about new quality productive forces, which you say will be a big part of the next 5-year plan. And this is a kind of typical feature of recent Chinese industrial policy. So can you tell me a little bit about why the emphasis on new quality productive forces is different from what came before? And what risks do you see coming from it?
Sure. So this concept was proposed about a year ago by Xi Jinping on his inspection tour. And it is rooted in the Marxist idea that you have productive forces and relations between these forces, and that forms the economic basis in which will influence upward on the superstructure. It strikes a similar chord as some of the concepts we have heard before, like high-quality development, innovation-like growth. But what is significant about this concept is that it is rooted in the Marxist concept, and it's not just about one specific industry, and it's create this theoretical framework that in which local officials can expand and elaborate what that means to their localities or to their industries. And this space, this concept created, I think, will be very meaningful and will be interesting to watch in the upcoming year. And this concept, I think, will be a key basis of China's 5-year plan from 2026 to 2030.
Yeah, thank you, Jin. And what about, like, say, for example, semiconductors? How has these industrial policies and the new quality productive forces helped China to tackle some of the problems around the international pressure on its semiconductor industry and to help it develop its own indigenous capacity?
Right. So it's about this ideas that thinking through creating productive forces, and you can create the clusters of different suppliers on the supply chain, upstream and downstream, and the linkages between them. It's more about this ecosystem approach to innovation rather than rather than supporting one single firm or supporting one single step along the supply chain.
Yeah, thank you. Lizzie, do you have a view on the Chinese semiconductor industry?
Right. So as I mentioned, I think, if we're talking about how much progress China has made, the picture is still very much mixed. One bright spot, memory chips. We're thinking about, YMTC making progress in NAND and in basic DRAMs. Companies like Nora, Beifeng Huachang, are making solid progress in terms of domestic tool making, right? And Huawei's SOT design is certainly showing real results. And, advanced packaging, that's certainly a bright spot in terms of delivering results. But there are certainly challenges, right? So when we're talking about SMIC, still struggling with low yields, and especially at the 5 to 6 nanometer spectrum. China's, the U.S. sanctions chokehold on advanced EUV, that's a huge problem for China. And China is still struggling to build a strong software ecosystem like NVIDIA's system for its domestic AI firms and GPU development. So that's also, another hurdle for China. But I think the trend is quite clear. I think China is going to make steady improvements in terms of domestic manufacturing, reducing reliance on foreign tech, and there will be more national data centers popping up to support China's smaller tech firms. And, related to Jing's question, I think Alibaba is actually going to play a role here. But we can talk about that later. And China is still, still lagging behind the United States in terms of the cutting edge. But China has dominance in terms of supply chain integration. China has dominance in certain chokeholds along the critical mineral line. And I think, basically we have this mixed picture, and how that picture is going to evolve is going to define the contour of U.S.-China competition for the years to come.
Yeah, Michael, you were a Treasury official in Beijing, and you've heard about the stimulus, new fiscal and monetary stimulus that was announced yesterday. I wonder if you could give us your take. Was this kind of preemptive action in anticipation of what the new Trump administration might do?
I think that the so-called policy pivot in late September, in retrospect, and I was in Beijing that week, I do think was a preemptive measure. I think what the Chinese authorities were seeking to do was sort of avoid a double confidence shock. The domestic economy is very weak. China's leadership, somewhat surprising to me, was actually very worried about the signal that the capital markets were sending to the rest of the economy. Not just low prices, but just basically a very dead stock market. And so I think that domestic weakness and then the prospect of Trump winning the U.S. election, I think, would have potentially been running the risk of a spiral of confidence. And so I think in retrospect, it was something of a shrewd move to get ahead of that. In terms of what we've seen this week, and we still haven't seen, we've seen the Politburo statement, we haven't seen the Central Economic Work Conference that will come later this week. I think it is going to send a message of further support for the economy, but I think we're still in something of a holding pattern until the March National People's Congress, because I think Beijing will use the time in between to really assess the risks coming from Trump across a variety of policy fronts. So the signals are important. But at the same time, I think we should take general statements of economic support with something of a grain of salt, because it is an effort to reinforce domestic confidence. But we'll have to see really what comes in March.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And how much has Beijing been concerned about the U.S. export controls, and how have they adapted in response to them?
I think Beijing has been very concerned. I think, we've reached something of a tipping point perhaps over the last week in terms of Beijing's response. We've seen the announcement of the export ban on germanium and gallium to the U.S., also China somewhat exercising an extraterritorial approach to that. And then we've seen the announcement this week of an antitrust investigation into NVIDIA. Now, of course, with all of these things, it's difficult to tell how much is retaliation in the case of, say, NVIDIA, but I think it's hard not to see it. So some of this was a response to the moves that the Biden administration make, but I think it is also a shot across the bow for the incoming Trump administration that, in contrast to the first Trump presidency, where Beijing was, on the whole, I think, quite passive when it came to responding to U.S. export controls, I think it is going to be more assertive this time. Clearly, there are risks for China being too aggressive on this front, so I don't think they feel like they have great cards to play, but this may be, some of the few cards that they do have as they see, a quite hawkish Trump administration take the stage.
Thank you. Lizzie, what do you see as the most likely impact of China's retaliatory measures against U.S. firms?
To circle back to the example Michael just pointed out, which is China's latest move, the first ever use of extraterritorial laws to restrict exports of gallium and germanium, I think that's a really big deal. So the immediate first-order effect is a supply chain effect. As we know, germanium, gallium are essential for semiconductors, for the defense industry, for clean energy. By cutting off those supplies to the United States, China is basically forcing American companies to scramble for alternatives. And that's not an easy task. So that will lead to higher costs, higher uncertainties, delays, headaches, and business survives uncertainty. Even the adjustment can finally pan out in some way. The adjustment cost is substantial. So that's the first order effect. And I think the second order effect is perhaps more important, is the signal Beijing's move sends, right? Basically, by applying its law extraterritorially, China is making it clear that we are mirroring your playbook. Our rules do not stop at our borders. For example, if you're a firm in Indonesia and you're using Chinese germanium and Chinese gallium in your product, and you are selling it to the United States, then China now can hold that Indonesia firm accountable, even if it's not a Chinese firm. So that's what China is doing here. I mean, enforcement is always a question, as far as we know, China really doesn't really have the surveillance tools and compliance system that United States has developed over many decades. But even without that, this is a game changer. Just the uncertainty, the risk, the danger it creates for business is a threat. And that's a kind of a shock value in and of itself. So that's some of the stuff that, we've been looking at. I think Beijing is going to use a combination of those real and potential threats, psychological and monetary fear factors to impose further stress on global firms. I think that's something we need to be on the watch out for.
Yeah. Jiang?
Yeah, just add on to that. I think China has been restrained in its response to U.S. export control and still taking a pragmatic approach. I would first point it out that China actually learned how to do export control from U.S. export control. It didn't have its own export control law before, but now it's been passed and it's in the process of building out the regulations under its export control law. And in fact, last month we just saw the release of the list of dual-use items from China. And some of the actions, like for example, NVIDIA antitrust investigation, that Michael talked about, it could be interpreted as building up the bargaining chips when we go into the Trump administration and see what can be bargained away. But you have to have the bargaining chips first. And but overall, looking at how China has been using its unreliable anti-lists and its anti-sanctions law and all those potential measures in its toolkit, it has been taking a pragmatic approach, and I think will still be.
Michael, how do you see Beijing navigating the Trump administration, particularly the tariffs that have been threatened against Chinese exports?
Well, I think we're going to see a combination of moves. We'll see somewhat more stimulus to offset some of the impact of Trump's tariffs if those are aggressive, and I should say only some of the impact. I think we'll see a willingness to accept a lower rate of growth because there's a reluctance to do a full amount of stimulus that would fully offset the impact of tariffs. I think we'll see at least some limited currency depreciation to offset the impact of tariffs, but only some because I think Beijing has a difficult balancing act when it comes to the currency. I think we'll see some retaliation against the US using some of the tools that we saw the first time around and some new tools, as we've just been discussing. And I think we'll see efforts by Beijing on the diplomatic front to keep exports open in third countries, keep borders open to Chinese exports in third countries. So I think it'll be a mix, really, of this full set of tools.
Lizzie, do you see that Beijing has any chips in this game?
So I think Michael already, addressed the question pretty comprehensively, and I think, Beijing is very much adopting a wait-and-see approach to see how far the United States can go, how far its economy can recover, hopefully, by early next year, whether domestic consumption can actually, be picking up some momentum. And it's very much a push and pull game at this point.
And how about with the EU? Where do you see China and the EU's trade relations going this year?
Right. So I think China is going to take a carrot and stick approach here, offering economic incentives on, rewarding good behaviors and applying subtle or not so subtle pressures to exploit internal divisions within the EU. This example just came out. Yes, today actually we saw Stellantis and CATL signing a deal on $4 billion, new battery plant in Spain. You might ask, well, why Spain? We know both Spain and Italy have been courting Beijing over the years. Well, Spain voted no on tariff. Italy voted yes on tariff. You see that carrot and stick approach playing out there. So I think Beijing is going to exploit those nooks and crannies, those subtle differences, subtle divisions within EU, maximize its leverage. So I think the EU is really walking a tightrope here. German car makers are interested in the Chinese market. The French government is more interested in the strategic economy. The Baltic countries, Poland, are more staunchly aligned with the United States. Spain, Italy might be more interested in courting China. So I think EU really has a lot of internal fissures to fix. Without fixing those can actually create openings for Beijing to maximize its leverage on the EU. So that's something that I think we need to be on the watch out for.
Michael, well, how about you? Do you see the U.S. policy toward China potentially bringing Beijing and the EU closer together?
I think yes. I think this is one of those questions that depends on how organized and disciplined the Trump administration is in terms of its approach. If it's an approach that we're imposing tariffs or other punitive measures on EU trade partners and China, that naturally will bring them closer together than a scenario in which the Trump administration is really focused on aligning support behind a sort of something of a united front on China. So I think this is one of those critical questions where we'll just have to wait and see how coherent the strategy is and what the priorities are of that administration.
Thank you. Now, we're about running out of time, and I want to make sure we get to some of the terrific questions that the audience has submitted. Thank you to all of you who've submitted questions. There are a lot. But Lizzie, I want to give you a chance. I don't know how much you've read about the announcements yesterday, and I just want to ask you, do you think that this next round of stimulus that we expect to hear the details about soon will go, do you think it will go far enough?
So, for now, it's still cheap talk, right? And talk is pretty cheap. The thing is, I think Xi Jinping has really depleted his personal credibility when it comes to talking, especially to the business community. I mean, relatedly, the Jack Ma's reappearance. I've received so many questions on this. I have to give an answer here. So, what's Jack Ma's reappearance really about? Is it proof of life, right? Is it, is Beijing just dusting off the ringleader of Chinese entrepreneurs to restore business confidence? Well, I mean, the proof of life part, I think, yes, we see Jack Ma is alive and kicking. We can all sleep well knowing that, knowing that. That's that. But, for the restoring business confidence part, the signaling narrative, I honestly don't know how much I can buy into that. The thing is, Xi Jinping's credibility with the Chinese business and investment community is shot. I mean, years of flip-flopping on key policies, heavy-handed regulatory crackdowns, regulatory whiplash. The business community is completely battered, bruised. Xi Jinping has a crying wolf problem here. And I think Beijing knows by parading Jack Ma around, it's just not nearly enough to fix that. So what's that really about? I don't know if we have time to go too deep into that, but I think it's related to Ant IPO's likely revival, but it's not just about signaling. And I just wanted to give you a quick answer of why I think that's indeed important. It has real economic footing here. First, China has been struggling for years to establish Shanghai as a tech IPO hub. Now it's still aspirational. There's no great tech firm if you look at the listings on Shanghai. If Jack Ma, if Ant Group, other China's most innovative firms actually list in Shanghai, that could potentially jumpstart or kickstart or restart the process to establish Shanghai as a tech IPO hub. So I think that's important. Second, China's capital market has a host of problems. The most primary problem, or the most important problem, is there are no good firms listed. If you look at the listed firms, they're like a graveyard of legacy firms you have never heard of. Some SOEs, you don't know if they're actually earning money or not, and multi-liquor companies. Those are basically the firms that are listed. So China has no shortage of innovative firms. Well, they are listed in New York, right? So that's a huge problem for China. If Jack Ma, if Ant Group as a magnet can actually attract some of the most innovative tech firms back to China, that could actually be important for China's capital market. By the way, that also has domestic consumption implications. Chinese retail investors struggle for years to find a place to put their money and wealth in. Previously, it was property markets. Property has 10+ return every year, not its capital market. If a prosperous capital market can be the substitute for property market, then Chinese household can actually see some growth here. So you see the importance of actually reviving its capital market. That's that. And finally, there's a Trump factor. There's the external factor, right? The United States is definitely tightening the screw on Chinese firms who want to list in New York, on Wall Street. So the timing is also right. So I think those are the real rationales behind that, that potential move. But again, I'm just guessing here. I have no idea if those conjectures are actually correct or not. But Jack Ma is alive, unlike some of the rumors you've heard.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lizzie. Now, we have some time for some audience questions. I want to start with this one. We've talked forever about a transition to a consumption-led economy, but it's not materialized. Why do you think Xi or Chinese policymakers are reluctant to shift to consumption-led growth? Michael, you have a view?
This is the question that I get with more than any other, no doubt. And it's a little bit complicated, but I think in short version, I think it's a few things. I think it's, there's still a reticence on the part of the leadership because they're not sure that consumption stimulus is going to work. Ironically, because consumption is a smaller part of the economy, doesn't have the same bang for the yuan that it would in the US. I think there's a political economy issue of not wanting to divert resources from initiatives that Xi Jinping thinks advance China's strategic priorities. So if you put that into industrial policy, it's pretty clear that you are advancing this push on supply chain resilience, tech innovation. If you're providing funding for households to buy another refrigerator, I think that trade-off is not exactly clear. So I think it's those and a few other factors. I think the door is opening gradually to doing more. Clearly, the math, the arithmetic for growth doesn't add up eventually. I think the big question is just, is the door swinging open quickly enough? And I'm still, I'm still not sure that we're really going to see a big shift towards consumption in the next year because I think the inertia is pretty considerable.
Thank you, Michael. So another question. In what ways do you think U.S. trade and industrial policies designed around competition with China may actually be turbocharging productivity and innovation in China? Kyung, do you have a view on this? Is the U.S. policies actually promoting China to?
Sure. I will speak specifically about the semiconductor sector. So before the sanction, and the domestic vendors, they all have a strong preference for foreign chips or foreign components in their systems, just because it's more cost-effective and it's much better performance. But now, with their lack of ability to have free access, they're forced to resort to domestic suppliers, even if this means that cutting into their margin, because domestically produced chips may not be produced on the most profitable production method, but you have to use it. And so we're seeing this trend of turning inward, and I think the leadership is hoping that this demand throughout this supply chain can create the momentum for the firms along the supply chain to innovate out of U.S. export controls. We'll see that play out in the next few years. We're very early in this process, and it's not going to be a linear process because there are multiple different technological paths to either catching up the U.S. or leapfrogging the U.S., and we're just in a very early stage to see that playing out.
Thank you, Chi-Hung. As another question, as China's population aging issue becomes increasingly severe, is investing in industries related to elderly care and services for the aging population a promising prospect? Anybody care to take that?
Well, this is one of the key projects we have planned for our pillar for 2025. So come back next year for our China 2026 report. We'll tell you whether that industry has actually seen success in that. But definitely, there's a lot of momentum. There's a lot of talks and excitement around that. Also, a lot of U.S.-China collaboration in terms of healthcare delivery. Also, pension fund reform, which is huge for Beijing, but we don't really have the time to get to today.
Yeah, in fact, someone asked us if we could each give our best China investment idea for 2025. But I'm sorry, you're going to have to call your broker. Okay, any final thoughts? Michael, what I was thinking was China has announced its target for GDP growth for 2024 as 5%. Do you think they're going to make it? Is it going to be exactly 5%? Or is it going to be a little less or a little more?
there's two questions here. There's where is the economy going to be, and then where is the official statistic going to come out? I think my guess is it'll probably be below 5%. I think 4.8% seems about right, and that is within the range of around 5%. For next year, I think it will be a slower rate of growth, clearly. If the stimulus that has been signaled this week really does come to pass, then it will be only a modest slowdown. If they overpromise this week and kind of underdeliver, then I think it could be considerably slower next year than this year.
Lizzie?
Right. So the answer to that question is actually in 人民日报第5版. So the fifth page of 人民日报, the title of the article is 经济增速怎么看当前中国经济问答? How do we view China's GDP growth? And the article states, well, specific GDP number is not important. Times have changed. Whether it's 5%, a little more or less, does not matter as long as we give it our all. So I'm going to make a bold prediction. The bold prediction is this might be the last year we are seriously debating China's official GDP target. And the 人民日报 article actually cited Xi Jinping critique GDP speed worship, calling for a shift in how we actually need to prioritize quality over quantity for GDP growth. So if China wanted to achieve 5%, it's not a huge challenge for them. Just ask all SOEs to dig up holes and fill up holes for the remaining of the year, then the target's achieved. But clearly that's not Xi Jinping's priority at this point, which I think is not necessarily a good thing. If China is willing to relent on that number, that might actually open up more space to actually implement meaningful reform for the years to come. So not necessarily a bad thing for China, but I think, that fixation on that number is going to relent starting this year or next year.
Thank you. Chi-hung, do you have a number?
If I have to take a guess, I would put it at 5%. But I would look out more for the quality of growth and not just the numbers. The numbers are easy to achieve. And I would look at if China has a good reign onto the local government debt level and the sources of the GDP growth. Is it just from subsidized demand, or is it from more sustainable sources of growth that can bring more long-term and higher growth trends?
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today for this conversation. Thank you to the audience for all of your great questions. And now we're going to have a little break.
We are going to our first spotlight presentation. It is on climate. And I'm very glad to share with you that in the past couple of years, we have partnered with the Rockefeller Foundation. We have mapped key stakeholders of climate actors from China, as well as a timeline of China's own incentives for climate actions and ambitions for the coming 5 years, aiming to build some resilience into the US-China climate collaboration with the mindset that we might have a Trump 2.0, which we are having one now. So this is a report, by the way. You see it on the screen. Have a read. It's done by our senior fellow, Dr. Wu Guoguang. Now we are facing Trump 2.0. We're again at a crossroad. So coming next is the CCA Fellow on Chinese Climate, Kate Logan, who will describe the choices China will face in its own efforts of fighting climate change. What China does in the coming year will be crucial to shape the future direction of global climate action. So Kate, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Jing. This is on and working, right? Great. So when it comes to climate change, China is often painted as the world's main villain. But what if China could also be our planet's biggest hero? Let me unpack what this means. Since 2006, China has been the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, accounting for roughly a third of global emissions each year. For years, China justified this by pointing to the historical emissions of developed nations. But here's the twist. China's cumulative emissions since 1850 have now surpassed those of the entire European Union combined. Next year, In 2025, China will face a critical crossroads. In one story, China is emerging as the hero. First, China's emissions are very likely now peaking about 5 years ahead of its stated deadline in 2030. This is due to China leading the world in renewable energy, including by installing over half of global solar capacity each year. Second, China's climate interests are increasingly aligned with its economic interests. China has become a dominant global force in clean technologies, especially solar, electric vehicles, and batteries. Over half of new vehicles sold in China are now electric, and Chinese companies now account for over 75% of global EV sales. So the clean energy transition is no longer just about cutting emissions, it's also a major economic strategy. And third, China is stepping up its role in global climate governance. At this year's UN Climate Conference, China played a key part in securing a major new goal on climate finance by agreeing to voluntarily count its own contributions despite still being classified as a developing country. But there's another story too. While China's emissions are likely peaking, it's still well off track on many of its other climate goals. So in order to meet China's target to reduce carbon intensity by 18% during the 14th five-year plan, for instance, as you can see behind me, emissions need to fall by 4 to 6% just next year. China is also still approving coal-fired power plants, even though those approvals have slowed, and energy consumption is rising much faster than expected, meaning even more clean energy will be needed to meet China's goals. China's clean tech dominance is also causing challenges. Overcapacity is pushing down prices and making it harder to find markets willing and able to absorb China's cheap green goods. And of course, above all, extreme weather events, fueled by climate change no less, are hitting harder each year, meaning that China will need to adapt its economy and infrastructure to these impacts while still not letting up on its decarbonization agenda. So, which path will China choose? In 2023, we launched the China Climate Hub to support the international community's engagement with China on its climate agenda. Here are 3 key questions that we're watching in 2025. First, how will the world hold China accountable for its climate leadership? With the US pulling back, Europe's role becomes critical, for instance. Will the EU, say, be able to work with China to raise its ambition of its new climate targets that are due next year? Second, will China find markets to absorb its overabundance of green goods? Developed countries are closing their doors and they're trying to bring developing economies along. But if the world can't find a way to work with China, then it could slow down the global energy transition. And third, of course, geopolitical tensions are wreaking havoc and making it harder to push for global climate cooperation. So will China be able to find a way to bring the world together, or will its actions push countries even farther apart? China could be a villain, but it could also be a hero. In the end, it's our planet that will be the final judge. Thank you.
Well, bravo. That's really well done, Kate. I think that is very rich, that is fascinating, that's action-oriented. Actually, that gives us some hope about the future of the planet. I think earlier this month, CCA also published another one-of-a-kind resource that consolidates nearly 2,500 different survey data from over 160 countries across 6 continents. It is so far the largest database of its kind. This comprehensive and user-friendly platform tries to visualize international views of China as its economic, political, and social and environment influence continues to grow. Next, we're going to have the author of this unique platform, Andrew Chop, which is our Fellow of Chinese Foreign Policy, to introduce this wonderful product. Andrew, the stage is yours.
Thanks very much, Jing. And it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce everyone tonight to CCA's latest online interactive global public opinion on China. So, is this working? Okay, so you might wonder, what might Kenyan media sensations over railway projects, riots in Honiara, the capital of the Solomon Islands, and very orderly demonstrations by supporters of Myanmar's military regime have in common? Well, they're all manifestations of the increasing strength and prominence of views on China among citizens around the world. As China's global presence has been expanding, particularly in the last 20, 25 years, we've seen citizens in most countries around the world kind of getting to know China, forming views with increasing degrees of strength. And along with this trend, we've also seen increasing numbers of opinion poll surveys. We just haven't put them together before. So that's what we've done in this project. We've put together, as Jing mentioned, 2,500 plus opinion surveys into one data set. What did we find? Well, first of all, there's a secular decline over time in China's overall positivity among citizens around the world. You can see a bit of a dip there around 2020 for the COVID time, but it's actually something much more long-term and structural. Probably has to do with when there's a new player on the block, they arrive and expectations are raised, and there's subsequently some level of disappointment. But it's not by any means all bad news for China here. China is genuinely popular on the continent of Africa, as you can see on the chart here. Overwhelming number of countries there lean in a favourable direction. On the other hand, though, it would be too simple to talk of a neat divide between the global north, famously negative on China in recent years, and the global south, leaning positive in some generalised way. If we resize the map to show the countries by their population, as you can do with the interactive tool, and we filter it by the global south, you can see that actually, in particular, India, with its 1.4 billion population, which leans in a relatively negative direction in recent times, actually offsets the whole continent of Africa, which has a similar population and leans positive. You can see here, India has been broadly on trend with the rest of the world, leaning positive in the 2000s, roughly neutral in the 2010s, to firmly in negative territory since 2020, the flare-up of the border disputes as well as COVID. But we also found other surprising results in other parts of the global south. Turkey is one country, major country in the global south that has consistently leaned in a negative direction on China. And Iran as well, despite the high-level accords that China has helped to broker between Iran and Saudi Arabia recently, and the generally close ties between Iran's rulers and the CCP. You can see the citizens have not shared a similar view. And then there's Latin America. So the largest country in Latin America, Brazil, shown here. China's had an approval rating there over a prolonged period of time, roughly equivalent to what it's enjoyed in many African countries, around about plus 30 or plus 40. Then everything changes with COVID. So Latin America is one place where COVID really was the game changer. You can see here that trend is repeated at the regional level, so you can find all of these views in the interactive feature online. So ultimately, what this resource is trying to do is really document and illustrate the process of citizens around the world getting to know China over time. So I'd encourage everybody to take a look at the resource. It's easily accessible from the CCA website. Explore those regions and countries of the world that you're particularly interested in, and keep an eye out for further updates as we try to build out a multi-dimensional picture of global opinion on China.
And I think the public opinion polls on China have shown us very nuanced and sophisticated new realities about China in the world. And as we have written in the report, China 2025, the coming year will proven to be pivotal in testing Beijing's resilience and adaptability as it confronts of an increasingly hostile geopolitical environment. I think it's fair to say that uncertainties will be the defining feature for China's foreign policy in 2025. So our next panel, last panel, led by our Senior Fellow on National Security and Foreign Policy, Lyle Morris, will help us navigate with his first-class panelists of such uncertainty and explore some new political realities of China's foreign policy in 2025. Over to you, Lyle.
Great, thanks, Jing. So I have the honor of being moderating the last panel of the night on foreign policy. My name is Lyle Morris. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for China Analysis. It's my great pleasure to welcome our panel of 4 distinguished CCA experts on Chinese foreign and economic policy to the stage to talk about what we can expect from China in 2025 in the foreign policy space. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip their bios because you have those in front of you, but let me just welcome Pascal, Sungmin, Brandon, and Philippe to the stage. Thank you for joining me tonight. So when I read the China 2025 report, one word that comes to mind is uncertainty. Uncertainty over the direction that Xi is taking China, uncertainty over China's economy, and uncertainty over U.S.-China relations under Donald Trump for the next 4 years. So with this backdrop in mind, let me start first on the trade and technology front. And Pascal, if I could start with you. So, trade and technology is clearly going to be a centerpiece of Trump in the next 4 years. How will this affect relations with the West and with China and the U.S.? I think is an important question. You've written a lot on critical minerals, de-risking, economic security in the context of China and its relations with the West. You're also recently, I must plug this book, China's Vulnerability Paradox, How China Transformed Global Commodity Markets. Great book. So given your expertise in this topic, my question to you first is, how should we expect questions about economic security, de-risking, to shift on both sides of the Pacific following the return of Donald Trump to the U.S. presidency? And specifically, if you can talk a little bit in the context of critical minerals.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here. I'm very, very pleased to be here. Such wonderful, terrific event and day. So what I want to do in the sort of 5 minutes or so, 7 minutes that I have, I want to do 3 things. So first, just to offer a couple of reflections on the broader backdrop to this evolving situation, then answer the question on critical minerals in 4 parts, and then end with some suggestion of a way forward, sort of different way to think about the problem. So a couple words on the broader picture. I think that right now we're facing a world where the 2 largest economies have become so deeply entangled in a deep sort of resonance. If I was as well versed in dialectical materialism as Dr. Rudd is, I might call it a dialectic, that we're not able to analyze them in isolation anymore. And I think this is actually a very recent phenomenon. That wasn't true 20 years ago. And this security dilemma, economic security dilemma that has developed, I think goes deeper than the sort of perceptions of each other's actions like we find in a traditional security dilemma. I think that it now finds its roots in domestic dynamics, which amplify it on both sides of the Pacific. Fractures in China's and the US's own systems, which have come to their own sort of an end of a golden era. Hyper, globalized neoliberalism in the US and reform and opening up in China. And this is leading to dynamics of, securitization, nationalist, populist tendencies, and has given rise to leaders in both cases that have less appetite for progressive reform and are perhaps less likely to back down. So this is sort of the backdrop. Now, what about critical minerals? So in the multiple discussions that I've had with my Chinese colleagues, including on a recent China trip, it's very obvious that these dynamics are present in that space. And we're actually doing mirroring research in China and in the US and Canada, on those questions in some ways. Except in this case, China's had decades head start in thinking about resources from a security perspective. It's something that we've only started to do, I would argue, very seriously over the past 5 years, perhaps. But these efforts on the Chinese side stem from a deep sentiment of vulnerability, actually, and continued reliance on imports, which is still true for the majority of its upstream supplies. So what, about Lizzie and others have talked about the recent announcements on export controls. What about those? I think that they're new in many ways, as Lizzie alluded to. Precedents were way more opportunistic and had more ambiguity to them. This December 3rd announcement is obviously really well coordinated and a direct reaction, retaliation. Second, however, I think we should pay attention to the wording of the December 3rd export control, so CURB's announcement, which say that in principle, the exports shall not be permitted. And I think that this hints at the fact that it does in fact play the role of signaling and in advance of Trump's coming back in January. The third thing I would say is that, I alluded to the fact that the US-China relationship is deeply interactive. Well, there are unintended consequences to export controls as a tool, as the US is discovering in the case of its own measures against China. And so for China to use these tools will also accelerate Western countries' incentives to diversify. It also has an impact on prices. So we've seen antimony prices rise 230% over the past year. Well, that's not good for all Chinese stakeholders. And many people are asking right now, would China impose the same sort of controls on broader classes of commodities like nickel or cobalt or lithium? Well, the only thing I would say, nothing is impossible, but low prices in these minerals have served Chinese interests very well. And in fact, increasing prices would solve a lot of problems for Western firms who have had difficulty in investing in those minerals for obvious reasons. So the last thing I would say on the critical minerals question for China is that it may be a good thing if China doesn't follow this to its extreme conclusion, as the US and the West, I would argue, is not ready to face the music on this front. We've relied on open markets for decades, and we are only now just realizing that this paradigm is ill-adapted to the pursuit of economic security. So just briefly, before I turn to the last comment I will say on the way forward, the return of Trump on this file will mean continued attention, I would argue, for sure. And he may want to, bring down regulatory hurdles domestically. He may be less interested in an ESG lens. But his de-emphasizing of the climate change angle and his tariff-based logic, maybe, as well as his aversion to multilateral sort of solutions, may be counterproductive to the objective of resilience in critical minerals chain. So I would argue that China's dominance is likely to be a reality we have to work with in the foreseeable future. So if I may offer an idea going forward, and I'll close with that. I think that we suffer from a case of cognitive dissonance and underspecified objectives in this area. In other words, we're trying to do too much or the wrong things. So how can we think about the problem differently? Instead of trying to de-risk So to remove the risk from the entirety of the critical mineral supply chain, which I think is an unrealistic objective, we might think instead along the lines of asymmetric resilience or targeted dominance, focusing on efforts at mapping carefully different critical mineral supply chains and identifying particular nodes or market layers where we can actually obtain leverage, given China's deep enmeshment and remaining import and export vulnerabilities. The goal here would be to build, and I'm keen to hear your reactions to this, a balance akin to MAD for nuclear deterrence, something that I could call mutually assured resilience, for example, between the West and China. And this would seek to increase, actually, the sentiment of security on both sides, instead of doing it on one side, which I think has negative implication down the road for our own security, while balancing remaining areas of exposure and vulnerabilities. So we would do this by modulating our exposure to risk along the supply chain, instead of trying to de-risk the whole supply chain. So curious to hear what you think about that, and thank you so much for your attention.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Brendan, let me turn to you if I could. You have worked extensively on looking at China's international economic relations, both in and out of government, and also its growing trade tensions globally in the context of Chinese overcapacity issues. So in 2025, what in your view will be the defining issue in Chinese international economic relations?
Thanks, Lyle. It's great to be here also. So in keeping with the theme of uncertainty you highlighted, the big uncertainty heading into 2025, of course, is new tariffs from the incoming Trump administration. So it's hard to say much with much confidence there. Other than that, they could have a significant impact. There'll be some whiplash, plenty of attention on it. I'd emphasize, though, as a somewhat more predictable issue, that China's industrial overcapacity remains an equal, if not more significant challenge to the global economy and trading system in the coming years, and one that we'll see play out next year with many of China's other trading partners. In the face of the anticipated U.S. tariffs, we've seen initial indications of China seeking to position itself as globally as a more reliable economic partner and supporter of free trade. I think that was China's leadership today and yesterday with heads of the IMF and World Bank and other institutions in Beijing. I would emphasize the key threat, of course, from the Trump tariffs, especially if they're applied more broadly, is reducing U.S. imports from other countries. And China has little interest in absorbing those imports and replacing U.S. demand. And China's broad-based trade surpluses are already causing significant trade tensions globally. So China's overall trade surplus is likely to hit a record high of over $1 trillion this year. China's manufactured goods surplus it reached a stunning 10% of GDP, over $1.8 trillion the last couple of years. This is really coming out of the pandemic amid a very weak Chinese demand. So we heard a great discussion on the earlier economy panel on China's recent policy turn. In the spirit of open discussion and debate, while I agree there may be some consolidation, some more attention on the issue, I don't see that really meaningfully addressing the overcapacity problem at a macro level yet. And also, it seems even if we've kind of stabilized some of the downsides of the economy, unlikely to see a significant boost to imports, and no real serious move towards economic rebalancing. So the policies driving China's overcapacity are here to stay, and a weakening RMB, if that's one response to tariffs, would only exacerbate some of those trade imbalances China has. So as part of that backlash, the U.S. announced its own tariffs on several Chinese sectors facing overcapacity earlier this year. I'd emphasize that the brunt of the problem, even in the absence of new Trump tariffs, will fall on other major economies, though, starting with the EU. And also appreciating the comments from Lizzie and Michael earlier. We saw the EU finalize its EV tariffs in October, despite resistance from some member states. And I know Philippe will speak to the EU-China relations later. I would just say that it's hard for me to see any alternative but to escalating EU-China trade tensions and also EU trade restrictions in the coming year, unless the EU is willing to absorb significantly, more of China's trade surpluses and lose whole industries in EU countries. So in addition to the EV tariffs, the European Commission has several counter-subsidy investigations underway, which should come to fruition next year at a minimum. And an equally notable shift is China's exports to developing economies, which by some analyses, exceeded 50% of their exports last year. That shift looks set to continue, spurring larger trade deficits with additional emerging markets. And we've seen trade actions taken by Brazil, Turkey, India, ASEAN, among others. So these are likely to continue next year. The primary solution, as Lizzie alluded to, from both the Chinese authorities and Chinese companies in response to some of these tensions is offering FDI in those economies, particularly in some of the clean energy sectors that China dominates. And that is understandably welcomed by those economies, can help their green energy transitions, and we should see more of that in 2025. That said, that hasn't been sufficient to tame these tensions. So basically, more investment is not an alternative to China actually buying the exports of some of these economies. So Turkey moved forward with its EV tariffs on China, despite sort of promises of BYD investment there. The public campaigns by South Africa, the China-Africa summit this fall, were notable, calling for China to actually buy more of its exports. And even in a place like Thailand, some of the Chinese investment there is displacing local production and has some cost benefits. So lastly, there's been some media reporting that China could offer a unilateral trade opening to contrast with U.S. tariffs. China has in fact eliminated tariffs on the lowest, sort of low-income countries, the poorest economies, even though that is probably unlikely to have much practical impact. And in my view, China has shown itself unwilling or unable to really do any market opening in response to other trading partners, including the EU in recent years. So it's hard for me to see much follow-through on that. So just in sum, even though we'll see a lot of attention on Trump tariffs next year, I wouldn't lose sight of the growing trade tensions China has with other partners.
Fantastic, thank you. Hopefully we'll have time to come back to the econ and trade part. We're going to move on to security and regional actors and how China has been responding. So, Sung-min, I noticed and read with great interest your recent co-authored article in Foreign Affairs titled "China Should Be Worried About North Korea, How to Make Beijing a Partner in Restraining Pyongyang." I found that title and the article fascinating, and I'd like you to expand on that. So my question to you is, how does China and Chinese analysts view the security situation on the Korean Peninsula, and how do they view the deployment of North Korean troops to Ukraine in particular?
Yep, thank you. Let me start with, so every publication has some background behind scene story. And then the story about my Foreign Affairs article was that, so when I submit the draft to the Foreign Affairs, on the same day, the news broke that North Korea sent its troops to Ukraine. So that was surprising, and then fortunately, the editorial team of the Foreign Affairs, they liked the draft, but asked me to update with this shocking news. So it is an evidence that the surprising nature of North Korea foreign policy and its impact on China-North Korea relations. So Lyle, when you invite me to speak on this panel, so I was writing an outline about my speech about, again, North Korea's surprising nature of their foreign policy. When I just finished my draft, our own president announced martial law. So there was a totally another surprise. So there was another, Korean Peninsula never failed to surprise us. So that leads to my central argument. In 2024, Korean Peninsula will be the area that Beijing and Washington will spend more time than actually the situation in Taiwan Strait. So I'll go over the China, North Korea, South Korea relations in 2024, and how they are likely to change in next year. So let me start with China's relationship with South Korea. And then to understand China-South Korea relationship, it is useful to see that as part of China-US relationship. And then we know that Beijing has been interested in stabilizing, if not really enhancing, but stabilizing US-China relationship, as we have seen the increase of the high-ranking official meeting, including the summit in San Francisco in last year in November. So as part of that, China was willing to stabilize China-South Korea relationship as well by holding China, Japan, South Korea trilateral summit after five-year suspension. And also on the same day when Vladimir Putin visited Pyongyang, China and South Korea, they hold their security dialogue, which was not held for 5 years. So there was an improvement, normalization of the dialogue between Beijing and Seoul. And from Pyongyang's perspective, North Korea would not really want to see that China is moving closer to South Korea and stabilizing its relationship with the US and also European countries. So it is understandable that Pyongyang was looking for external help, and then Russia is the only available option. And then luckily, Putin also needs just North Korea's help in terms of ammunition. So they increased their cooperation, and then Pyongyang leveraged this relationship to press China, as if sending a signal that Beijing, what are you doing? Why are you playing with Washington and Seoul? So that has been the situation last year. But I think this dynamic will change once the next administration comes in. So first, I anticipate China and South Korea will be moving even closer with each other after President Trump takes office. So Chinese analysts, they are largely worried or pessimistic about U.S.-China relationship after once Trump administration comes in, as there are already, given all this possibility of trade war and then hawkish China policy from the next administration. But at the same time, they are not shy from expressing their optimism that Trump's foreign policy, if history is any guidance, Trump's foreign policy will cause friction with the US allies again, including South Korea. So they see an opportunity as well to pursue closer relationship with the US allies, including South Korea. And then second, I expect China and North Korea will also move closer. If Trump administration somehow tries to end the war in Ukraine, North Korea's strategic value to Russia will decline. Then Pyongyang needs to extract economic and diplomatic concession from Washington, and then Trump administration will be willing to strike a deal with North Korea to negotiate a de facto arms control deal. And for China, China will not really allow North Korea to pass Beijing directly talking with Washington without Beijing's blessing. So, and also in the middle of the US-China strategic competition, China will bring in North Korea closer to its orbit again, so there will be a restoring of the strategic partnership between China and South Korea. So both South Korea and North Korea are likely to move closer to China in 2025. Finally, let me address the implication of South Korea's domestic politics for Chinese diplomacy. So the aftermath of martial law has left the South Korean politics in turmoil. All the defense minister is already arrested, and all the commander of special forces, they are under investigation. So, and then morale is really destroyed for this moment. So it is a prime opportunity for North Korea to conduct any provocation if they want, although I don't think they plan to do so. But the problem is that there will be a temptation for Kim Jong-un to do something to make use of this situation. The problem is that if anyone follows South Korea's military operation, South Korea's military doctrine has changed very offensive over the last 7 to 10 years. So now South Korea's military operation has this plan to preemptive strike and also retaliatory strike. So if Kim Jong-un makes any mistake, unlike in 2010, South Korea will respond in advance and after being attacked. So we really wish Kim Jong-un would not make mistake seeing what's happening in South Korea now, and that need also increase China's value because China has an influence over Pyongyang or can deliver, has a strategic communication channel with Pyongyang. So when South Korea needs China's help in warning North Korea, that means China's growing influence over Korean Peninsula again. So that's how I see what's going to happen in 2025.
Great, thank you so much. Philippe, let me turn to you for the view from Paris and EU. You've been following China's relations with European countries for a long time now. So given the US elections of Donald Trump, do you think we can expect a, quote, European shift towards China? And if so, what would be the criteria for such a shift or a change? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lyle. I think Lizzie said EU is walking on a tightrope, so it's a good description. But this is a tale of a relationship that was described, the EU-China relationship was described by the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell, as a dialogue of the deaf. On one hand, you have a China that is keen to develop relations with Europe, and that has been claiming so for many years. Both on trade, on global issues. We heard about climate earlier, people-to-people, diplomacy, Africa, joint projects, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, you have a serious drawback on the European side. And our colleague Andrew Chubb earlier went through his wonderful work on public opinion. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Europe is the area where public opinion is the most negative on China. And of course, the reasons are not so different from what Andrew described, COVID, and I would probably add the propaganda around COVID and the very counterproductive propaganda that was made over Europe. I'm thinking of countries like Italy, Greece, France, where very negative comments were made on the ways Europe was handling the pandemic. Secondly, Ukraine. My colleague just next to me mentioned the war in Ukraine, and certainly this has been for the past two and a half years. A daily, trauma for Europeans to hear about on a daily basis, and the reports we hear about China's support over the war in Ukraine have been very negative and have not contributed to an improvement in Sino-European relations. And to a certain extent, I would say the Middle East, and China's attempt to play a diplomatic role in the Middle East have also not been well received. When you think about what's happening in Syria now, for example, and China's, attempt to get close to Assad, over the past few years, and now you look what's happening to this regime. And lastly, trade and the economy, and I would say European presence in China. Well, a French diplomat was giving me a figure the other day. There were 5 or 6 years ago, there were 60,000 French citizens in China. The number is now down to 22,000, and including Hong Kong. So I think it's, it reflects the general worsening of relations between China and the West. But, the thing is, there's no strategic competition between the EU and China. There is one between this country and China. And the way the Chinese media are reflecting the relations with Europe are fairly positive still. But on the European side, it doesn't reflect this way. And the number of tourists, there's now a free visa policy into China. Any European EU passport holder can travel to China for 1 month now, and it's going to be extended for another year or two. We haven't seen massive numbers of European tourists going into China, nor have we seen the return of Chinese tourists massively. But let me come to perhaps an issue that is of interest to everyone. That's trade, and of course, as we heard, as we know, trade imbalance has increased. And sanctions have increased or have been introduced for the first time by the European Commission on electric vehicles mainly. It's only 38% it's been done in a very European way. There was like 1 year of investigation in China. All the car manufacturers were investigated, and they come up with various trade. Now, this is not going to end up well for the European car industry because everybody assumes that even with such trade sanctions and tariffs, the European car industry is in deep trouble. We just heard that on the battery sector, a Swedish company called Northvolt has just filed for bankruptcy. This is one of the largest battery manufacturers in Europe. I'm not even talking about the solar panels, which is vastly dominated by the Chinese. Now, let me come to, your question, Lyle, on the effects of the Trump, of a new Trump administration, and of course the general view of China by European leaders. So when President Macron visited the White House, I think in 2018, he said to President Trump at the time, why don't we talk about China? Why don't we sort of address the China issue? Trump's answer was, well, I'm going to deal with China myself, but before that, I'm going to deal with the EU, which is worse than China. So that gives you an idea of how people feel about Trump. But on the other hand, it's like we're kind of used to him now, as we all are. Now, of course, the climate issue will be not have a good effect on Europe. Obviously, the fact that the US will withdraw. There is a chance, indeed, that some European voices will say, well, why don't we do more business with China? But then there's all these issues I mentioned before. And then the Ukraine war, of course, is still going on, although that may not be for very long, depending on how the new Republican administrations deal with that. But at the same time, let's remember that the Trade and Technology Council, the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council, that is functioning quite well, is and addressing a number of China issues, was started during the Trump administration. So in fact, the new administration has actually engaged better with Europe than the current one. That's my understanding. Having said that, we are not particularly in good shape in Europe. I have to be very clear on that. And even though we have a more geopolitical-minded European Commission, the divide and rule strategy of China has worked pretty well, and the next few years are going to be very shaky with a weaker Germany and France. And in terms of China policy, we will have to rely on the European Union rather than on individual states.
Great. Well, I feel like we're just getting warmed up, but unfortunately, I'm getting the signal that we need to wrap. So thank you all for your comments and for engaging on these topics. And please read the China 2025 report. Please give a round of applause for the panel and the panelists.
I think next one, we're going to have our next spotlight presentation. Even though I think US-China relationship is securitized and even over-securitized, I dare to say, from our internal statistically data, I'd like to share with you there's still huge interest to understand more about China from more human-centered perspective. Our most read article published by CCA is called 19%, which reflects the overall reality about the future of Chinese youth. So I'm more than happy to introduce to you the author of the 19% series, the CCA Fellow on Chinese Society, Dr. Barclay Bryan. So Barclay will talk about the effect that the poor economy and the persistent inequality have had on Chinese youth and what we can draw insights from understanding them better. Barclay.
A few years ago, a video went viral in China. It showed a student at Kyung-wha University cycling home late at night. He's riding his bicycle in one hand, and in the other hand, he's got a laptop propped open, and he's doing his homework. Kyung-wha University is arguably the best university in China. Its alumni include Xi Jinping himself. And yet, here was this student, late at night, cycling while doing his homework. Online, they called him the Kyung-wha Involution King. Involution is a term that has become popular in recent years in China to describe a feeling of futility that many people feel. It's the sense that no matter what you do, you can't get ahead. I mean, consider this student. So the year that this video was taken, in 2020, Kyung-wha admitted 3,800 undergrads. But that year alone, there were 8 million high school graduates in China. So this student had achieved seemingly the impossible, but yet he could not rest. Even from point A to point B, he felt like he had to do his homework. And that's why this term, involution, neidran, which means to spiral inwards, has become so popular in recent years. This sense that, to think about it, like to spiral inwards, right? It's like wheels spinning in the mud or trying to pedal a bicycle with no chain. The sentiment that this video captured was, if you can make it to Kyung-wha University and still be this involuted, then what help was there for anyone else? So my name is Barclay. I'm a fellow of Chinese Society here at CCA. And today I want to present to you some of the materials that I used in my project, the 19%. So let me show you another video, this time from the COVID-19 pandemic. This is from the infamous Shanghai lockdown. It shows 3 COVID prevention workers who have turned up at the door of a young couple. They're telling the couple inside that they are the close contacts of someone who has tested positive for the coronavirus, and therefore they need to be carted off to a quarantine center. But the couple is refusing to comply. The man of the house is quoting back relevant laws to the officials, and he says he will not go. And one of the officials, dressed in the white hazmat suit synonymous with the pandemic in China, steps forward and he wags a finger at the man of the house, and he says, if you refuse to comply, there will be a serious punishment. A punishment so serious, it will affect 3 generations of your family. And the man of the house reaches for the door to slam it in the official's face. And as he does so, he says, thank you, but this is the last generation of my family. Videos like this, they're more than just viral ephemera. You see, that phrase, the last generation, 最后一代, that became a touchstone in China. And it captures the anxieties of Chinese youth today who are debating whether or not to have children. We know that the fertility rate in China is very low, and we know that the Communist Party views this as an existential threat to society. And we can look at fertility statistics, and we can debate the government's pro-natalist policies. But videos like this help to capture some of the stuff that is not immediately available in the data. To me, this is a metaphor. This man slamming the door in the face of the authorities. It captures the sense of futility and the sense of frustration that many Chinese people feel about a society that they feel has grown untenable for the future. This is precisely the kind of materials that we use here at the CCA when we look at Chinese society from the inside out. I'm an anthropologist by training, and I think that metaphors like these are crucial to understand Chinese youth and the difficulties that they are going through as they face the future. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Buckley, for providing the human-centered narratives about Chinese youth. That's really the depths of things we're doing here at CCA. And we're also a think and do tank. There's another project I want to give a small shout out here. It's called Dragon and Eagle. I think Josh, are you here, Josh Lauder? Oh, hey, Josh. So this is another project that Josh, myself, and a few others are convening together, including Dr. Bob Lee, who's going to share something with us very shortly. We conveyed a group of equally concerned youth from US and China, trying to do something concrete to stabilize the relationship. We can talk about that more in the year 2026. We just started. But I want to give you another example that is using our China access and China knowledge to do something better that is transcending border. Our co-founder of Cure for Cancer Project, Senior Fellow of Public Health, Dr. Bob Lee, currently the Global Head of Medical Affairs at AstraZeneca, leading a team of over 1,000 medical scientists trying to cure cancer within our lifetime. So Bob will share with us some of his insight, how CCA and Cure for Cancer are working together to utilize, as I said, Chinese knowledge, China access to advance global public health equity, and accelerate the cure for cancer within our lifetime. Bob, stage is yours.
So after a whole evening of academic, scholarly, geopolitical, and economic analysis, I'm going to switch gears to give an individual perspective. And I don't have great videos to show either. But I'm going to talk as giving you a perspective from a cancer physician and also someone who has experienced cancer in their family and in their loved ones. And I'm sure this resonates with many in the audience. So in my 20 years in clinical medicine, including the last 10 as a practicing medical oncologist just up the road at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, I have taken care of patients who were billionaires, cabinet ministers, dignitaries, royal families, and also social outcasts, the mentally ill, and those struggling in homeless shelters. But I can tell you the experience and the struggle upon a cancer diagnosis is fundamentally the same. When you get diagnosed with cancer, the whole world tips upside down. And then there's fear, it's devastation to yourself, to your family, to your loved ones. And then there is this struggle to survive and also to improve or maintain the quality of life. That's a fundamental human struggle that is the same irrespective of your geopolitical background or views. However, despite the technological advances that we have today, we have 10 million deaths from cancer every single year. 1 in 3 people in their lifetime will be diagnosed with cancer, statistically speaking. Many say that cancer is the emperor of all maladies. I believe it's true because it is really intent on doing one thing, and that's killing the human life, but it does so gradually with relentless cruelty. Now, we are living in a day of scientific explosion, technological transformation, the 4th industrial revolution. We can go occupy Mars, yet we cannot cure cancer. And I mean that by eliminating cancer as a major cause of death in our lifetime. We don't have a blueprint in doing that today. Now, why is that? Well, training and learning and practicing as a physician and a scientist in clinical trials, I've come to realize there is this one bottleneck, and that is at the clinical trial level. And that is the critical step of translating scientific knowledge and discoveries into actual clinical practice that will save lives. That is a rigorous scientific process. It involves testing of the safety and the efficacy and the improvement of this medicine or this innovation or this vaccine or prevention in saving human lives. But that process is 10 to 15 years long for any new invention, and most processes fail, so we don't have that many 10 to 15 year cycles in our career or in our lifetime, and therefore the status quo is not going to get there. And the reason for that is fewer than 5% of patients actually can get access to clinical trials. Despite all the academic societies and guidelines, and the scientists call this the best treatment for a patient with cancer to improve outcomes, because that is access to innovation beyond what you have today. Fewer than 5% of patients get it. Now, we had the luxury when I was practicing at Memorial Sloan Kettering, a lot of patients get access, but that is really a niche population of patients. If you look at America wide, there's vast inequities. Most people miss out. They miss out on the trials. They even miss out on the standard of care today. Any breakthrough from yesterday, they are missing out. So that vast inequity is really is really slowing us down and preventing us from getting to the cure for cancer. There's also the vast differences in individualized person care, the lack of diversity in clinical trials, also preventing us from getting the cure for cancer. In this modern day of precision oncology, that is giving the right drug, the right medicine to the right patient at the right time, depending on the precise molecular alterations, whether it's a gene mutation or a protein signature, we have to target it precisely to deliver that magic bullet that shut down the cancer and the patient gets better. But that is now a slice and dice, a very fine niche population. And often we have these American patients here we treat, but there's not many of them. And if you don't collaborate with the rest of the world, for example, some mutations are actually much more common in other countries. And if we don't collaborate, we don't get the clinical trial data together, we're not going to get help for these American patients here who need help. So one example of a major breakthrough in lung cancer is the treatment for EGFR mutation positive lung cancers. And that's really a pill that shuts down a mutation called EGFR. And it works so much better than chemotherapy. It just melts the cancer away, but you have to have that mutation to get the pill that you take once a day, and far safer than chemotherapy. Now, it turns out this mutation occurs much more common in Asian women who have never smoked. And there's growing research to show that this may be to do with cooking and the air pollution and so forth, lack of ventilation in the kitchens and so forth. But this is a phenomenon that is so common in Asian women, more than 50% sometimes in some regions, and much rarer here. So when AstraZeneca invested in and developed their EGFR inhibitor, a pill, and working with the Chinese oncologists and clinical trial investigators, they were able to do a clinical trial in workhorse speed and getting first-in-human dosing in phase 1 to FDA approval in 2.5 years, which stands the world record for cancer drug development today. 2.5 years, because there were just a ton of Chinese patients. And when I talked to the people who were doing the trial, it was 200 patients in 12 days. They just flooded in because they could get this life-saving medicine that they would not have otherwise had a chance. And that led to US FDA approval so fast that the industry was even really struggling to come up with a name fast enough for the approval. And the American patients were the first to benefit from this discovery and this contribution, largely from China, but other Asian countries and the rest of the world as well. So what can we do today? China happens to have more than 30% of the world's cancer deaths, 10 million deaths, more than 30% in that one country alone. America is number 2 in terms of cancer burden. So number 1, number 2 victims. They have a common enemy. And of course, the rest of the world suffers the same. So what can we do today as individuals? Well, at Cure for Cancer, which is a CCA initiative in close concert with the Bloomberg New Economy International Cancer Coalition, a multi-stakeholder leadership coalition, we work together to engage governments, including China, to open up their regulatory policy framework for clinical trials. And we're very proud we've made progress in that regard. China has actually shifted a lot of the regulatory decision-making on clinical trials from the Ministry of Science and Technology, which is very security-focused organ. This is like data control, Xinjiang, Tibet, no leakage outside of China, to the National Health Commission, which is a lot more open to international cooperation with data sharing and international research. We also engaged with China on a US FDA initiative called Project Orbis, which gets multiple countries to work together, which can simultaneously review and simultaneously potentially approve new cancer medicines and breakthroughs at the same time, cutting red tape rather than doing it sequentially, which increases the cost and delays access to patients. So this is a simultaneous review of clinical trials at the same time to get early access to patients. We've made progress in China. They opened their mind, completely turning around from a no way, we're not doing any sharings, national security concern, to something that's a lot more embracing with the US and the rest of the world. And basically, if invited, they would join. We have made some progress. We've engaged with President Biden's administration, and there's a lot of open and transparent discussions, but for a variety of reasons, including US domestic politics, the concern of looking soft on China, you have to be tough on China, so it just didn't go through. And we look forward to engaging with President Trump and his administration to see if President Trump can cut a deal with China, one that could potentially save millions of lives, both in America, in China, and the rest of the world. So I finish by quoting Kevin Rudd, who told me once that the course of history is not shaped by fairy dust, but is by individual committed women and men, individuals who make the difference. So with all the challenges presented in our China 2025 report, immense challenges in China, the post-COVID debt crunch, the healthcare system under strain, the source of mistrust, growing mistrust in the healthcare system, there's also opportunity that the Chinese government is also looking for solutions and actively listening for solutions. Actually, a strong US is actually preventing Chinese hubris, which, by the way, in the course of Chinese history has always led to its downfall. But so therefore, a strong US is actually shaping Chinese to a positive trajectory. So I call upon the committed individuals in this room to seize this opportunity to make the difference, shape a better world, including cure for cancer. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. That was a wonderful, hopeful, and uplifting message to finish. And after such a rich program, I'm going to forego my concluding remarks. Just want to share with you my own 2 minutes reflection and 2 minutes exact. I do hope our program today offers you a small peek of the depths of our China expertise. I think from politics to foreign policy, from economy to technology, from climate to public health, from US-China relationship to the future of global order, we're seeing China really is everywhere, and China is not going anywhere. I have been quoting Yu Yingshi frequently for many years now. Wherever we are, China could be, and China should be. For the sake of a better China, for the sake of China, for the sake of Asian American community in the USA, we need to understand China better. For the sake of a better US-China relationship, we need to understand China better. For the sake of a better China in China, we need to understand China better. And as Bob just said, for the sake of a better global public health, for the sake of peace and prosperity of humanity, we need to understand China better. And the Center for China Analysis is here for that very purpose, to decode the complexity of China, to build the bridges with Chinese people, and to understand China from a human-centered perspective, and simply to understand China better.